जय हो।
श्री श्री राधा वृंदावन चंद्र की जय, श्री गोपाल नाथ जी की जय, श्री श्री जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा महारानी की जय, श्री गौरताय की जय, श्री प्रहलाद सिंहदेव की जय, गौर प्रमाणित। So thank you so much, especially to the organizers of the mantra retreat for giving me this opportunity to say a few words, and to devotees here in Vrindavan for providing us this wonderful facility to gather. Today's verse, I was told, is Canto 3, Chapter 3, text number 27. This is the penultimate verse in a chapter called The Lord's Pastimes out of Vrindavan. This is Uddhava speaking to Vidura, summarizing Krishna's pastimes all the way up to his disappearance. And now he's coming to the disappearance of the Lord, which is going to be described in the next chapter. So he's leading up to that with the Lord's pastimes in Dwarka, outside of Vrindavan. And when he completes this, of course, he's in too much distress, Uddhava, so he will send Vidura to learn from Maitreya Muni rather than learning from himself, which is what Vidura originally wanted. So this is text number 27, and here it's describing how the people of Dwarka went to a place called Prabhasa Kshetra, which is where they went for religious activity, and eventually they're going to get drunk there, and they're going to fight with each other, and everyone's going to be destroyed. So this is going to be the end of the Yadu dynasty. But we haven't come to that point yet. They're still doing their religious activities, and they're offering profuse charity to the Brahmins who are there, which is what's being described in this verse today. So please repeat. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Maybe we can turn down the mic just a little bit. It's very echoey a little bit. Thank you. And I can louden my voice here. Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
Vasansya jinakambalam.
Vasansya janakambalam.
Vasansya janakambalam.
Vasansya janakambalam.
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
Haram vritti karim api.
Dharam vritti karim api.
Haram vritti karim api.
Dharam vritti karim api.
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
Vasansya janakambalam.
Vasansya janakambalam.
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
Haram vritti karim api.
Dharam vritti karim api.
Please chant.
हिरण्यं रजतं शय्यां
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam.
वासांस्य जिनकम्बलान्
Vasansya janakambalam.
यानं रथानि भानकन्या
Yanam rathani bhan kanya.
धरां वृत्तिकरीमपि
Dharam vritti karim api.
Ladies.
Hiranyam rajatam shayyam. Vasansya janakambalam.
Yanam Ratani Bhanakanya
Dharam Vriti Karimapi Hiranyam Rajatam Shayam Vasansi Ajanakambalam Yanam Ratam Ivan Kanya Dharam Vriti Karimapi Hiranyam Rajatam Shayam Vasansi Ajanakambalam Yanam Radhani Bhankanya Dharam Vriti Karimapi Hiranyam Rajatam Shayam Vasam Sajina Kambalam Yanam Rathani Bhankanya Dharam Yuktir Karimapi
Hiranyam gold. Rajatam gold coins. Shayam bedding. Vasansi clothing. Ajina animal skin for seats.
Animal skins for seat.
Kambala blankets. Yanam horses. Rathan chariots. Ibhan elephants. Kanya girls. Dharam land. Vritti Karim to provide a livelihood. Api also. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The Brahmins were not only given well-fed cows in charity, but also gold coins, bedding, clothing, animal skin seats, blankets, horses, elephants, girls, and sufficient land for maintenance. Purport. All these charities were meant for the Brahmins, whose lives were devoted entirely to the welfare of society, both spiritually and materially. The Brahmins were not giving their services as paid servants, but the society provided them with all necessities. It was arranged for some of the Brahmins who were in difficulty for marriage to be given girls. The Brahmanas therefore had no economic problems. The Kshatriya kings and rich mercantile men would provide them with all that they needed, and in exchange the Brahmins were completely devoted to the elevation of society. That was the way of social cooperation between the different castes. When the Brahmin class or caste gradually became easygoing, being fed by the society, although they had no Brahminical qualifications, they degraded themselves into Brahma Bandhus, or disqualified Brahmins. And thus other members of society also gradually fell down from the social standard of progressive life. As described in Bhagavad Gita, the caste system is the creation of the Lord and is arranged according to the quality of work rendered to society and not in terms of birthright, as falsely claimed in the present degraded society. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunditam Jnana Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So the key idea here in this verse, this and the previous and the next verse, is the Yadava's practice of dharma, of their social duty. Now, dharma has quite a range of different meanings. It comes from the Sanskrit root dhar, which means to support or to sustain. And dharma, when followed nicely, is that which sustains the world. Its range of meanings can be everything from ritual to society to ethics. One of the fundamental questions that you find in the in Sanskrit literature as a whole is the question of what is my dharma? Essentially, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, these epic stories, are basically accounts of very good people put into extremely difficult circumstances, where this question, what is my dharma, is meant to be figured out. Right? They're meant to struggle with that. And we, as readers and listeners and observers, are meant to learn from those circumstances to figure out how do we practice dharma in our own lives. So the question, what is my dharma? What is my dharma? Is a question that's asked at multiple levels in these Vedic literatures. On the one hand, what is my dharma can be asked in a immediate context. As in, what is my dharma now, at this moment? All of us have been faced with circumstances where we feel pulled in different directions. Right? Our family wants us to do one thing and our job requires us to do something else. Or it's a moral dilemma that we're faced with. Someone comes knocking on our door and is in a panic and a sweat and saying, I'm being chased by a violent murderer with an axe. Can you please give me shelter? Thank you. So we open our door, we put them in the basement, and we hide them. A few minutes later, there's another knock on the door. And we open it again, and it's a guy with an axe. And he says, have you seen someone go by here? He looked like this, and so on. What do you do in that circumstance? One of your dharmas is to be honest, right? Do not lie. Satyam vade. Speak the truth. Another one of your dharmas is to be non-violent, right? And you know the guy with the axe. People don't carry around axes just like that. So what do? Right? And most people in that circumstance, they would decide that their dharma is to be non-violent. Right? This honesty can wait for the moment. That's a fairly obvious circumstance. I think most reasonable people would make that choice. But that choice is not always obvious. And we see again and again in Mahabharata and Ramayana where Arjuna or Lord Ramachandra, they're faced in very difficult circumstances where it's not at all clear what your duty is at this very moment. In fact, we still debate their decisions even today. So that's one level. What is my dharma now, in this moment? We might raise the scope of it and say, ask the same question, what is my dharma in a lifelong situation? What am I meant to be doing with my life? This is the type of question students often ask when they're choosing a major. Or we ask when we're trying to decide on our career. Or maybe during a midlife crisis. Right? We're trying to figure out, what am I meant to be doing with my life? Or when we're older, looking back and saying, what's my life been about? So here, instead of asking the question in the immediate, what is my dharma now, we're asking in a lifetime situation, what is my dharma, generally speaking? What am I meant to be doing? What's my nature? And so one of the meanings of the word dharma is nature. Right? What is my inclination or capacity? And thirdly, we can ask the question, what is my dharma in a transcendent context? What is my duty towards God? What is my duty towards myself as a spiritual being? And this level of dharma is the most stable. This is what we might call paro dharma. Right? This is dharma that doesn't change. It's more about a process of discovery, of trying to figure out who we are, who is Krishna, what is our relationship. The first level of dharma, what do I do now? This is an ethical consideration, right? And so one way to translate the word dharma is ethics and morality. What is my dharma now? What's the right thing to do in relation to this person or to this situation? The second level we talked about might be regarded as social dharma, society, law, interpersonal relationships, community, the social level of dharma. And this is the type of dharma that's described in books like the Dharma Shastras, which are focused on law and social relationships in society in different periods of time or history. And the third level might be considered to be faith or religion or one's eternal relationship with God, Sanatana Dharma. So, in other words, this word dharma encompasses everything from ethics and morality to law to the organization of society to one's eternal relationship with God. Everything is covered under the word dharma. And this is why it's nearly impossible to find a good translation for the word dharma. Sometimes it's duty, sometimes it's occupation, sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's faith, sometimes it's ethics, sometimes morality. And all of those work, and none of them work. Because each one only captures a little sliver of what this huge concept of dharma is. As a side note, in other traditions like Buddhism and Sikhism, the word dharma is used in yet other contexts. So if you're talking to a Buddhist and you talk about dharma, they speak of dharma, they will understand the teachings of the Buddha as being dharma. Right? The scriptures themselves are called dharma, a sense that's not frequently used in the Vaishnava tradition. So it's one of these words, and in general, the more important a word is, the more difficult it is to translate. It's just one of these things where if there's an easy translation that makes sense, that word is probably not all that important. And if you have to spend a long time trying to translate it, nothing quite works, it's because that word is foundational to that entire system or thought or tradition and so on. And dharma is one of those words that's so foundational. The very first verse of Bhagavad Gita, the first word of Bhagavad Gita is dharma. Right? Dharma kshetre kurukshetre. And Krishna's final instruction in Bhagavad Gita is about dharma. Sarva dharman parityajya. So it's everything, practically speaking, and therefore very difficult to translate. Now, what's being discussed here in the purport by Srila Prabhupada in the context of this verse is one piece of dharma, which is the social aspect of dharma. He's not speaking of eternal relationship with God, and we'll do that in the next verse. He's not speaking of ethics and morality in the individual context. He's speaking specifically of social relationships. And here, highlighting specifically the quality or the role of the Brahmins in the system of Varna and Ashram. There's a couple attributes of kind of Brahminical relationships and Brahminical roles and Brahminical Varnas that Prabhupada is describing here in the purport. And I think the first most important thing to remember is that the relationship between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas is one of cooperation, but cooperation in tension. We find this over and over again throughout the Vaishnava and Sanskrit literature in general. That the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, the priests and the educators and the administrators and rulers are always working together, but never quite comfortably. The most famous example of how this breaks down is between Ambarish and Durvasa Muni. Right? Durvasa Muni is ready to kill Ambarish. and also King Vena and the Brahmins. And many such instances are there, where they are in a lot of tension with each other. And that's not just a sign of a problem. That's actually the way it's meant to be. You see, the Brahmins and Kshatriyas are complementary, but they each lack one thing very important. The Brahmins have authority born from knowledge. We find this in every society, even contemporary societies. People who are educated, who have knowledge, who are experts, are relied upon by media, by politicians, by everyone, as consultants, as people who provide information. They have authority, the Brahmins, but what they lack, what they're supposed to lack, is the resources to put that authority into action. They don't have power of the physical kind. They don't have weapons. They don't have armies. They don't have money, which is what drives all things in action. And the Kshatriyas have all of these things. They have the resources. They have the power, the armies, the money. They can do everything, but they don't have the authority or the legitimacy to act without the Brahmins. And so the system is supposed to provide not only cooperation, but cooperation in tension. And this is why throughout the Vaishnava literature, the Sanskrit literature, you find incidents of tension over and over again between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, because that's the way it's supposed to work. The Brahmins are supposed to provide checks and balances, a break on the power of the Kshatriyas, which can become very intoxicating. And the Kshatriyas provide a break, maybe some realism, to the knowledge and education and idealism of the Brahmins. For this reason, Prabhupada is saying here, the Brahmins do not receive a salary, they're not paid servants, he says. And this is crucial, because as soon as you are employed by someone, then you speak in a way that pleases them, right? Because your job's at stake, and job means sustenance, and sustenance means your family, and everything is at stake. And so they live off of charity. Now, this is reflected somewhat, to some extent, in kind of the modern American university system, with the institution of tenure, for example, where a professor is receiving a salary from the university, but the idea of tenure, the theoretical idea, although it's come under attack in recent years, but the theoretical idea behind it is to provide some level of independence to the professor, that when you prove yourself to the broader community of scholars, then you should be able to say and speak the truth without fear of reprisal, without fear of losing your job. And tenure essentially says that you cannot be fired unless you make some egregious ethical mistake. Like there's some real ethical issue between you and your students or your colleagues, or you cross the boundaries of the fundamental norms of the profession. You cannot be fired just for your views. That sort of protection. So in this system, the Brahmins essentially achieve that by not receiving a salary, but living off of donations, charity. Now, one thing we might ask right away is, well, charity can produce the same sort of dependence, right? You've got someone who's giving in charity regularly, like the king, for example, or some rich merchant for whom you're doing priestly work. So isn't that charity going to produce some level of dependence, and you're going to speak things that they want to hear? And the answer is yes, of course. Even charity, not just salary, but even charity can produce some level of dependence. And this is why there's different types of Brahmins in different roles. Some that are very closely associated, that are adjacent to power and wealth, like the Brahmin in the king's court, who the king turns to, practically on a daily basis for advice about what he should be doing. And then there's the Brahmin who lives outside the city walls, in the forest, whom the king might visit once a year to consult, and everything in between. There's a whole range of Brahmins and their level of connection to power and wealth. It's a spectrum, not an on-off switch. Just because you don't receive salary doesn't make you entirely independent. It really depends on your willingness to be independent. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to each level of proximity. For the Brahmin who's in the king's court, the big advantage is that this person can give advice that's practical and contextually relevant. They know the kingdom is almost at war. There's no point in saying, when the armies are at the city doors, there's no point in saying, well, we should be nonviolent, O king, because the citizens are in danger. So I need to advise the king as to how to fight in a dharmic way. So there's a practicality there to that proximity. But there's a disadvantage to that proximity too, which is when the king really needs honest advice. He can't be sure that the proximal priest, minister, is going to actually offer that. Because ultimately, he knows that Brahmin's livelihood is dependent on his charity. And so when things are really at a crossroads, especially in the king's own life, he goes to the forest. Outside the walls of the city, like Maharaj Dasharatha did, to get advice. This is often on matters of things like retirement. Should I step down from the throne? This is a question you can't ask people who you employ. You can't say, oh, Brahman, in my court, should I retire? What's he going to say? Yes, king, I'm ready for the next guy. Of course not. He's going to say, no, please stay forever. Right? His livelihood is dependent on your charity. And so he has to go outside the city walls, to go to that Brahmin whose life is not affected in any way by the king. Very, very little. Very little. It is affected a little, but not much. These are the Brahmins, these are the sages that Lord Ramachandra really looked forward to seeing when he was sent on exile. This was one of the positive things about the exile that he actually mentioned early on, before he left, to Sita and to Lakshmana. He said, this is going to be great. We're going to get an opportunity to meet all these sages like Agastya, who we haven't had a chance to see for a long time, because the king usually doesn't have a lot of time to get out of the city walls into the forest. And Lord Ramachandra got advice, very valuable advice, and skills and knowledge that he used for that entire exile, but also for the rest of his life. So in other words, educational, intellectual institutions are best when they are not directly tied to political and administrative power. And we need such persons in such educational institutions at every level of proximity and distance from centers of political and administrative power. Those that are just adjacent and those that are very distant. Because each one provides a different sort of function that's just as useful in different circumstances. The proximate one, the adjacent one, provides advice that is perhaps not as idealistic, but practical and immediately relevant. The one who is distant provides advice that can be unaffected in any way by the dependence that comes from charity or salary. Okay, so the relationship between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas is one of cooperation, but also tension. And that tension, that checks and balances, is an essential part of the system. But cooperation can easily turn into corruption. Because what happens is the same system that enforces the tension between the two, well, all it takes is for the two sides, or one of the sides, to give up their value system and say, look, King, I've got all the authority, I don't have any money. You've got all the money, you don't have any authority. How about we get together? And you get me the money, and I'll get you the authority for whatever you want. And as soon as that happens, in any political system, that's corruption, right? Where then the citizens are stuck under a leadership that essentially is colluding with each other to shut them out, just to claim all the resources of that society for themselves. We see this happening over and over again. But this happened exactly with the Varnashram system that Prabhupada calls presently degraded. Essentially, that tension turns into collusion and corruption. And the Brahmins figure out how to exploit their position. And the whole society starts to tumble. You see, when the Vaishyas and Shudras step out of line, that's typically an administrative problem. The administration deals with it. The Kshatriyas deal with it. When the Kshatriyas step out of line, the Brahmins have to deal with it. So there's the story of Parashuram, and the story of the Brahmins, and the story of King Vena. Right? They figure out how to delegitimize the present king. And again, this is something you see happening in societies, even today, over and over again. That intellectuals, educated people will stand up and delegitimize what's happening in terms of the political situation. But when the Brahmins step out of line, that's a significant problem. Because you see, who disciplines the Brahmins? It's the Brahmins themselves. Throughout history, educational and institutional communities have policed themselves. In today's world, today's academic society, this is called peer review. It's very difficult to fire a professor, nearly impossible. I can say from experience, just seeing the system. I've never thankfully had to fire anyone. But if you look at the system for how it happens, from the day that you figure out something is wrong, it takes 5 to 6 years at a minimum to let go of a tenured professor. From an administrative standpoint, as an administrator, if you want to come in and say, okay, you're done, it takes 5 to 6 years. But from a peer review system, a professor can be shut out of their field within a year, within months. Right? This is called self-governance or faculty governance. The Brahmins have to police themselves. They have to figure out how to set standards where they live up to their own values and morals. And this can be very effective most of the time. When it doesn't work well, when the Brahminical community ends up becoming corrupted, or as Prabhupada says, degraded, then the whole thing comes crumbling down. Because now, no one knows who the expert is. No one knows who they ask. No one can trust their teachers. No one knows whether facts are facts. No one knows where to look for in terms of knowledge. And when this takes place, the Bhagavatam identifies specifically Shringi as the moment, as a key turning point. When the Brahmins discover that, hey, we've got power and we can use it. This was Shringi's thing, right? What was Shringi's trick was this. He said, I'm a Brahmin, you're a Kshatriya, Maharaj Parikshit. You, he said, are like dogs eating it from our table. And so I can tell you what to do. And I can do with you as I please. Watch this. Right? And he curses Maharaj Parikshit. And his father is devastated by that act. Not just because it's a kid who made a mistake and it's his kid, because it represents something that's fundamentally that fundamentally undermines the entire system. It's when the Brahmins decide to deploy the one thing that they're not supposed to put their hands on, which is physical power and wealth. He's crossed a boundary. You can give advice, but you're not going to use sheer power to accomplish what you have. Sheer strength. And so the system collapses. And so what starts to happen is that the Brahmins and everyone in the system begins to look at their position in power, use it to exploit those who are next to them, who are below them. And this devolves into something so terrible in terms of the system of caste that essentially everyone below the Brahmins find themselves suffocated. And the lower you are, the more suffocated you are. To the point that anyone who was below a Kshatriya, their very presence was defiling to a Brahmin. And if you were so low on the caste totem pole to be of a Shudra or an outcast, an untouchable, then your sight, your sound, your smell, everything was defiling enough that it required extreme punishment, for both sides. The untouchable was, of course, unspeakable harm done to them through physical beatings and excommunication, separation, all of that. And for the Brahmin who had come into contact with that person, losing their caste status altogether. To enforce, rather than a spirit of service, which is what Prabhupada is describing here, right? That the Brahmins give their services to the entire society, and out of gratitude they support them. Rather than the mood of service, it became a mood of protecting your position and your power and making sure that you are separated sufficiently from other castes so that your power is not affected by them. And so, even as the Bhagavatam spends pages and pages and pages praising the Brahmins, to the extent that in places there seems to be no difference between a Brahmin and a Vaishnava, like in the story of Jai and Vijay, where Lord Vishnu is praising the Brahmins and Prabhupada is translating every time it says Brahmin to Vaishnava. From a situation of the Bhagavatam like that, we find that for the past 1,000 years, the Vaishnava Acharyas have spent their time speaking up against the products of the Varnashram system, namely the caste system, the degenerated idea of caste. Right? So it's such a huge transition that you find from praise of the Brahminical community and its support, like we find in this verse, to over 1,000 years of criticism from the Vaishnava Acharyas for the misuse of power and authority by the Brahmins. All the way from Srimad Ramanujacharya to the present day. And through, of course, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You find this over and over and over again as a theme. So much so that when that famous verse in Bhagavad Gita chapter 9, Apichet Sudurachara Bhajate Mam Ananyabha, even if one commits a terribly sinful act, if you worship me, Bhajate Ananyabha, with with focused attention, then you are to be considered a sadhu. Ramanujacharya, 1,000 years ago, he takes that terrible thing, apiche suduracharya, he takes that in the sense of someone transgressing caste rules. Because that was the terrible thing in those times. Prabhupada in the purport, he describes it as doing something, an ethical transgression, an accidental fall down, specifically. But Ramanujacharya has other concerns in mind, because he's surrounded in a society where the worst thing you could possibly do is step outside your caste boundaries. When we come to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, of course, just yesterday we had the disappearance day of Haridas Thakur. And I'm sure you heard some mention or account of Mahaprabhu's relationship with Haridas Thakur, and particularly his disappearance, and how he carries his dead body and dances with it in Sankirtan. In order to appreciate Mahaprabhu's relationship with Haridas Thakur fully, we need to recognize the context in which he was having that relationship. This was a context of caste discrimination that was so intense that merely a momentary contact with someone who was not Hindu or a low caste Indian could ensure that you were outcasted from whatever caste you were. You know, when Rupa and Sanatana Goswami come to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they meet him, and they say that we are so defiled that the world is offended by our presence. That's not false humility. It's not even just humility. It's a reality. What was their fault? They had accepted service under a Muslim king, under a Muslim administration. The Nawab Hussain Shah of Bengal. So they were outcasted by the general Hindu community. They had lost their rights as Brahmins to do worship or ritual or temple or so on. So it was a fact the world was offended by their presence. Not to mention a Muslim, a Yavana. Mahaprabhu, at that time, Mahaprabhu is a Brahmin, Vishwambar Mishra, and a sannyasi, the pinnacle of the caste system at the time. That meant very strict rules on who you can contact. I mean, one evidence of that is that, as far as we can tell from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Mahaprabhu almost always took prasad in the house of another Brahmin, even though there were Vaishnavas of all different classes. But that was the standard in society at the time. A Brahmin would extend an invitation to lunch to a sannyasi. No one else would dare to come close enough to ask them to do this or that, not to mention visit their home. So for Mahaprabhu to visit Haridas Thakur, why? Because Haridas Thakur had been excluded from Jagannath Puri temple. Why? Because he was socially at the bottom of the totem pole. For Mahaprabhu to visit him for that reason, bring him Jagannath Prasad, to just speak to him face to face, would have been deeply offensive, would have been scandalous at the time. And then to touch him, and then to pick up his dead body. For a Brahmin sannyasi to contact a dead body under any circumstances, even a Brahmin's dead body, is polluting enough where you have to be in quarantine for weeks. Right? This is the rules after a death in the family. You can't go to a temple, you can't leave the home, you can't cook your food. Right? You have to be, there's rules of purity and pollution. This is for a death in your family that is the same caste. This is why there are people in the caste system who deal with dead bodies. And they are the lowest of the low. They are considered outcast by the outcasts. That's how low they are. But this is how terrible the system became. Is that those who are untouchables developed their own caste system and made certain people untouchable even amongst them. And those who deal with cremation ground attendants were one of them. Right? So this is why you have someone else deal with the dead body, even of your own caste. Under any circumstances, to touch a dead body would have been horrific. But to touch the dead body of a Muslim, who you're not supposed to touch even while they're alive, that's the most scandalous thing you can imagine. And yet Mahaprabhu did it. Publicly. He danced in Sankirtan on the shore of the ocean and buried Haridas Thakur with his own hands. And so while the Bhagavatam spends a lot of time praising the Brahmins, for the last 1,000 years, the Vaishnavacharyas have spent their time dismantling the notion of Brahminical purity based on birth, in order to make this fundamental point that the Lord is interested in the quality of our hearts, not the purity of our bodies. And so His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, took that same idea, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, took that same idea and took it to its logical next step, which is to say, if Mahaprabhu could dance with the body of a non-Hindu and could coronate him Namacharya, the Acharya of the holy name, then anyone can become a Vaishnava. We understand that through bhakti, prarabdha karma, even the karma currently that we're experiencing is destroyed. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says that what that means is that any impurity born of our bodies is destroyed through the process of bhakti. Because bhakti destroys. Nirdahati kintu cha bhakti bhajam. Bhakti destroys our karma. Past, present, and future. And therefore, whatever karmic situation may have led to our birth, in this family or that family, in this race or that race, this nationality or that disadvantage is extinguished, it's burnt up by the practice of bhakti. And therefore everyone has not only the capacity, but the duty to become the Lord's servant. And so those three levels of dharma that we talked about, Prabhupada said, look, this idea of social dharma, to understand what it means, you have to look at the next level of dharma, which is our relationship with the Lord. The highest level of dharma has to inform each of the other levels of dharma, so that we know we can keep them in the proper perspective. Otherwise they get blown out of proportion. Our eternal dharma to the Lord has to inform our social dharma. Our social dharma has to inform our ethical and moral duties individually. But the guiding star has to be our relationship with the Lord. That Paro Dharma, which is the main point of the Srimad-bhagavatam. Thank you all very much for your attention. I'll stop there and see if can we have time for a question or two? Or is it too late? Okay, I saw Nutama Prabhu first, and then Gaurani Prabhu, and then over here.
Well, forgive me for asking this question, but I think as a professor of history, you've elucidated a lot of historical things that most people don't know. We still hear today, yes, everything you said is true. Maybe 1,000 years, I've never even heard that number. It's very enlightening. But yes, our acharyas speak against its nationalistic conception, its bodily conception, its racial conception, gender, the whole thing. But not gender. I mean, certainly that doesn't speak to women. I mean, please, we hear those arguments. So can you please help us understand if those are valid arguments or perhaps not?
Yeah, so you raise an interesting point, which is that Vaishnavas throughout history have spoken up against looking at the body as and bodily designations as the measure of a person's worth and their potential, their capacity. They have never exploded the entire social system, any social system entirely. They've worked from within those social systems to transform them, right? And this is a distinction that I think it's important to note, because there are religious systems that choose to explode the social environment altogether and say everything needs to be destroyed, right? And a more sense of like an antinomian or an anarchist approach to reconstructing social relationships. Vaishnavas has said, no, look, this is the situation in this particular society. We'll work with it, but we will work to change it from within and keep pointing people towards the ultimate. Because of that fact, for those who want to prioritize, elevate, focus on certain social roles as being important, can find the justification for doing so. Those who want to elevate the Brahmins as being the most pure, you can find plenty of verses in the Bhagavatam to support your perspective. And for those who want to elevate a certain race or skin color over others, you can find support for such things, and so on. Of course, that's missing the main point, the main purpose of those descriptions, but you can find it. And so also with gender relationships. You can find different social roles being described in the Bhagavatam and other texts. But the problem is, in those situations, is that we often we fail to distinguish between what is descriptive and what is prescriptive in scriptures. What is being described and what is being prescribed. So, for example, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu only ate at the house of Brahmins. So, therefore, every sannyasi within our movement should only eat at the house of a Brahmin, and that too a Brahmin by birth, because that's what Mahaprabhu did. No, that's a description of his activities given the environment around. That's who extended him invitations. The prescription is found differently, right? The Kiba Vipra Kiba Nyasi Shudra Kemanoi Jai Krishna Tattva Veta Shai Guru Hai. A guru is one, whether they're a Brahman or a sannyasi or a Shudra. Krishna Tattva Veta, if they know the truth of Krishna, their guru. Jare Dekho Tare Koho Krishna Upadesh. That's the prescription. It's very clear, it's crystal clear. So I think we make the same mistake in regard to gender, just as we can in regard to caste, in regard to any social. Yes, there are different social roles, and yes, these are described in the scriptures, and yes, these roles have changed for thousands of years. Just like Brahmins' roles have changed. No more kings anymore, right? One of our greatest, longest living kings and queens has just passed away yesterday or the day before. Right? The age of kings is over, and queens. So Brahmins' roles have shifted. So men's roles and women's roles have shifted throughout the centuries and ages. What's descriptive in the scriptures and what's prescriptive? The prescriptive element is one that Prabhupada makes clear over and over and over again. That when it comes to spiritual capacity and service to the Lord, and man, woman, child, everyone has the capacity to do the service they like for the Lord and achieve the highest perfection from it. So it's a big topic, but that's a little something. Gaurav. Okay.
I'll save my question because it's a little off topic, but anyway, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the exposition of this topic. So, Prabhupada spends a lot of time describing the ideal society with his forecasts, and as far as Prabhupada's practical work to organize a society within a society is come, and little communities within that society, temple community. So, in your study, have you understood what Prabhupada's idea was for actually implementing some of the good points of this Varnashram system within ISKCON/temples? Because nowadays it seems that the Kshatriya types have more influence, way more influence in ISKCON and temples than the rabbinical types. So is that, anyway, this is just observation. I don't know. I'd sort of like to hear your perspective on it.
There's a lot of things that can be said about this topic. Thank you for that question. There's much that can be said, but I mean, if I can speak from personal experience in terms of advising students over the years and kind of observing people develop their capacities, I think in today's world it's very, very difficult to distinguish between who's an educator and who's a Brahmin and who's a Kshatriya and who's a Vaishya and who's a Shudra. And particularly in a Vaishnava community, this becomes even more difficult because of the fact that each one of us is asked and inspired to do seva, to do service. And as Prabhupada so often said, do the needful, right? And so we find that there's one purport in Bhagavatam where Srila Prabhupada speaks of apad dharma, that in a society where there is, in a time where there is a danger or emergency, apat, then dharma applies in the sense that everyone needs to do the needful. And Brahmins can do the work of Kshatriyas, and Kshatriyas can do the work of Brahmins, and so on and so forth. And then it's very interesting because in that verse, in the purport, Prabhupada goes on and says the entire Kali Yuga is apat. It's a terrible time. And he says, therefore, we need to do what we have to do to spread this Krishna consciousness.
Emergency.
It's all an emergency. This whole age is an emergency. Right? And so, you know, I think, okay, we can try to distinguish and we can create some sort of system and classify people and so on. But honestly, we're not yet even past the caste system that Prabhupada is criticizing here. It's still a reality in much of India. And so we try classifying people, it's going to be very easy to slip right back where we came from. Maybe 1,000 years from now, we'll be ready. But as for now, as far as I can tell, people have all kinds of tendencies. And it's best to inspire them in whatever seva they want to do. One thing I want to note here, and it reminds me in relation to your question. As devotees, we are asked to take on, there's so much similarity between who we're asked to become as devotees and the qualities described of a Shudra. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that the work of a Shudra is service to others. And that's our life as a Vaishnava, is service to others. Do you know the title given to Shudras in traditional Indian caste system? Das. That's the title each one of us take at initiation. We take on the work of Shudras, we take on the title of Shudra. And we call each other Prabhu, which is what Shudras do to other castes, while we wear that Brahman thread. Right? So it's very, like, it's very, at this point, I think it's often very counterproductive for us to take young people and start to classify them. It can, not only counterproductive, it's nearly impossible to do. People come with so many different tendencies. The main point is to say, how can you serve Krishna best? And inspire people to serve Krishna to the best of their ability, whatever they do best and however they're inspired.
Hare Krishna Guru, thank you so much for such an amazing insight. If I could just add something, I want to request Gordon to an amazing story that's very personally related. It's actually about him, so I want to put that to you share. But before that, I just wanted to share, I hope it's not too much of a controversial point, but just an observation that generally in ISKCON, when we talk about instituting Varnashram, we tend to jump very quickly into the Varna part of Varnashram, which is actually, as you're saying, for all the reasons you're saying, it's quite difficult, and we can end up in stirring up more trouble than benefit. But what if we put that energy into really establishing healthy ashrams? And to the extent, just that kind of a suggestion, that perhaps it's to the extent that we have healthy functioning ashrams and loving, mature relationships between the ashrams, to that extent, you have a healthy space within which naturally what your Varna is becomes apparent, and it's not something you have to force or categorize, artificially. That's just an insight. But on that point, Gauravani Prabhu shared an amazing story that I want him to share with everyone. I think it's amazing.
Just one thing, that's I think an excellent suggestion, insight. I find that in teaching students, it's the ashram discussion that gets them most excited. It's not, am I this or am I that? Because they don't know what they're going to do with their jobs and their lives and so on, and sometimes things take us. But the ashram discussion, that's very meaningful to them, and the idea that of being able to see where we're at in life and how we're best meant to perform the actions connected with our age, that's very individually oriented. So Varnashram has a socially oriented dimension, which is Varna, and then it has this individual dimension, which is Ashram. And I think that's a wonderful suggestion. So thank you for that.
So my birth father, Bhargava, was one of Prabhupada's artists. He did the original cover for the Bhagavad Gita painting. And so he really thought of himself as a servant of Prabhupada in the arts. And he once asked Srila Prabhupada, if I had a son before I existed, should I train him to be an artist like me, Srila Prabhupada? Thinking in the Varnas. And Srila Prabhupada said to him, you are not a potter. He said, you are a Vaishnava and a Brahmana. And one day you'll be asked to put down your tools and worship the deity on the altar.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, let's
tandem on that question.
Yes, I just want to make sure that we have time for one question from the ladies, because we've had a lot of questions from the men. So please make it very brief and then we'll.
Do you think that Prabhupada's first attempt at making the GBC all like householders, temple presidents, he took Tamal Krishna, when Tamal Krishna took sannyas, and he moved up from the GBC, and tried to create a class of sannyasis. Do you think there was an attempt to try to address this Varna situation?
I don't know honestly. I haven't given that question thought myself. Maybe something to think about. Yes, please.
Somewhat of a question or comment about the Varnashram Dharma. It seems to be more like based on the bodily concept of life, that in this body and work prescribed according to this body, the man's role, the women's role. So, and then also in Mayapur, just a few years ago, there was one Mataji cooking in the kitchen at the temple, the jar, I guess, of the tea kitchen, and she caught on fire, and there was a brahmachari there, and he failed to assist her to put out the fire. Instead of helping the sister, he left, I guess, to find somebody to help another woman or something. So I'm just kind of reflecting on this, and this is kind of like a big thing at the temple, and the women were like, kind of felt like, where's the compassion or humanity in this kind of system or way of thinking? So I was just wondering if you could, kind of speak on that or shed some light on that? Have any realizations on that?
Yeah, that's a situation like that is like letting the guy with the axe into the house and saying, "Oh, there he is," right? It's following one dharma while sacrificing the higher dharma, and it essentially this is specifically what the Bhagavatam describes as a situation of apadharma. When you're in an emergency situation, everything goes out the window. You do what needs to be done in that moment. And the dharma of ahimsa, non-violence, and karuna, compassion, is a samanya dharma. There are certain dharmas that are called samanya dharmas throughout Vedic literature. These are dharmas that apply to everyone, regardless of your varna, regardless of your ashrama, regardless of your gender, race, nationality. They're samanya. They're for everyone. Forgiveness is a samanya dharma. Prabhupada describes in one purport in Bhagavatam. Everyone needs to practice forgiveness. Not just the Brahmins, not just the Kshatriyas, everyone. So, same thing with non-violence and compassion. And for Vaishnavas, it goes without saying, okay, ahimsa, non-violence towards others, non-injury, is a generally appreciated value across every society and culture. But Vaishnavas are asked to go beyond ahimsa to karuna, to compassion or mercy. See, you can be non-violent just out of duty. I don't want bad karma, so I'm going to be non-violent. I'm not going to get involved, so I'm going to be non-violent. But karuna or compassion forces you to go beyond non-violence and say, even though I could choose even though I could be non-violent, even though I could stay away and it would not be any violence, I'm going to insert myself into a situation where I might not even be asked to be present, right? For example, Prabhupada staying in Vrindavan would have been non-violence. He was harming no one there, right? He was living a peaceful life. That would have been non-violent, but it would not have been karuna or mercy. Mercy means stepping beyond your boundaries, beyond what's safe and comfortable to help another. That's compassion. That's mercy. There's no compassion or mercy when we stay within boundaries and do our duty. That's just dharma. That's ahimsa. That's non-violence. When we choose to step beyond what is our duty, what is asked of us to help another, that's compassion. That's karuna. And that's the foundation stone of what it means to be a Vaishnava. That's Krishna's most beautiful quality that Uddhava describes in the previous chapter, aho bhakti stanadanaku. Right? So that type of situation is kind of the exemplar of non-Vaishnava behavior. What to speak of non-human behavior? It's not even humanly compassionate. But for a Vaishnava, you have to insert yourself in places where others need help, even if it's not your duty to do so. Even if it's not required of you. That's compassion. Thank you.